There is a common misunderstanding about how to bring peace to the war in Ukraine. Some say if Russia cannot negotiate peace, then it will just have to win on the battlefield. But here is the problem. Wars are lost on the battlefield, but peace is never won there. Russia cannot make peace with the USA. It's learned that the USA is just too unreliable. So if there is to be peace in Ukraine, then difficult though it might seem right now, Russia and Europe need to realise they have a common interest and make peace. Welcome, I'm Jeff Rich. This is The Burning Archive, where I am doing a whole series on the end game in Ukraine. The peace negotiations seem to be deadlocked. No one is quite sure how the war can be brought to an end, and one of the reasons for that, it is a very complex conflict. I've outlined how it is a 5-state war and none of the parties are really clear on how they can move from conflict phase to conflict settlement phase. And I've provided a video on the United States recently and also actually commented on how Dick Cheney had played a major role in getting the Ukraine war started. Today I'm going to look more closely at Russia and how it got into the war, what this war is really about from Russia's point of view, and some of the challenges Russia faces in actually moving from conflict to conflict settlement, moving from war to peace. First, let's have a quick recap of just how Russia entered this war. It is an important thing to clarify. Of course, there is much discussion about how Putin's legal and moral invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was the start of the war, that Russian aggression, imperial aggression, was the start of the war. I have never really believed that argument, and I've covered that issue many times on the channel and on my podcasts and in my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com, so you can read the background arguments there. But I think it's very important to the resolution of this conflict to be clear that this conflict, the seeds of this conflict, go back way past 2022. They go past 2014, when Russia will often refer to the coup in Kiev. They go past 2008 and NATO's invitation for Ukraine to join NATO, the reddest of red lines for Russia. Indeed, they go all the way back to 1989 to 1991 and the US's role in manipulating the situation in Ukraine to facilitate the breakup of the Soviet Union. The conflict the conflict of overreaching and creating major strife between Russia and Ukraine was evident to observers then. And I covered some of that in my video on Dick Cheney, but let me also just quote a small little exchange between the British ambassador to Moscow in 1991 and Anatoly Sobchak, then I think mayor of St. Petersburg, and indeed a mentor to later President Vladimir Putin. So this connection is really quite relevant to, I guess, the thinking of the current players in the events. And this is discussing exchanges between these people at the time when the Americans encouraged and facilitated Ukraine to declare independence, much to the shock of the elite within Russia. And if I just read from Vladislav Zubok's book, The Collapse, just for a second, the historical significance of Yeltsin's decision was enormous. That is, to accept Ukraine going separately from Russia. It ran against the grain of centuries of Russian history and mindset. The British ambassador, Roderick Braithwaite, wrote, and he's been quite vocal and supportive of various anti-Russian viewpoints since, perfectly sensible Russians froth at the mouth if it is suggested that Ukraine, from which they all trace their history, might go off on its own. That was the quote from Braithwaite. Russian-Ukrainian relations, he said, are as combustible as those in Northern Ireland. The troubles in Northern Ireland had not been settled yet by 1991. But the consequences of an explosion would be far more serious. The mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, in conversation with a British official, accused the West of courting Ukrainian separatism. This encouraged the breakup of the Union, he said, and would kill Russian democracy. The British official argued that the West had no option but to deal with practical realities. Sobchak countered that the West underestimated its capacity to influence events. Quote, Sobchak said, it was the West's policy of recognising realities that allowed Hitler to rise to power. So there you go. That indicates just how much the conflict was seeded way back then in the events leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, I won't go deeper into this story. I've covered it in other videos, and I really do encourage people also to check my video interview with Richard Sakwa about his book, The Second Cold War, or The Culture of the Second Cold War, but also his discussion in there of the emergence of the conflict in Ukraine and its the deep layers of that conflict. But the very important point is to understand from Russia's point of view, this is a defensive war, not a war of aggression. And its strategy in the war, its strategy in the peace negotiations, to some degree has followed from that, but is now reaching a critical point where perhaps it also needs to be re-evaluated. It has pursued a policy of patient defence against a slow-motion invasion across many domains since 1991. The eastward expansion of NATO, the infiltration of its society and economy and politics by Western culture, by Western agents, the diplomatic aggression against Russia, the economic war against Russia in their sanctions and the Cancel Russia campaign. And at the recent Valdai Discussion Club Forum speech by Vladimir Putin, there was an interesting other very significant defensive war that was invoked from Russian history. Vladimir Putin spoke about the Battle of Borodino, part of the defensive war strategy response to Napoleon's invasion. And Napoleon and much of Europe's as part of the French Empire's invasion of Russia in 1812. Arguably, Ukraine in 2014 was contemporary Russia's Borodino moment. And the Ukraine war since 2022 on a different kind of set of battlefields was Napoleon's march and occupation of Moscow. But now Russia really needs to switch from defence to expulsion of the enemy and engagement with Europe, just as in between 1812 and 1814, Russia both chased Napoleon through the snow out of Russia and then liberated Europe by marching and fighting Napoleon for 2 or more years across the continent of Europe. After defeating France and Napoleon in Russia, Alexander I marched the Russian army all the way to Paris to liberate a newly constituted Europe by 1814, and then didn't just defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, but played a central role in the Congress of Vienna to establish and to win a fair and enduring peace for Europe, the Concert of Europe, which in some respects held pretty well for a century. And in new geopolitical, new geographical, new historical, world historical circumstances, you can see Russia as in a similar situation today. And I do wonder whether that is part of the reasoning behind Vladimir Putin's reference to Borodino at the recent Valdai Forum. And I should point out that this is just not my crazy opinion from my study. The distinguished historian of Russia who wrote the book Russia Against Napoleon, the whole story of the Russian campaign against Napoleon, he observes at the end of the book that ultimately when Russia and Europe are partners, then the security of Europe, of both, is better. And I think there is an important lesson there for Russia's diplomatic strategy going forward in 2025. So what is the situation for Russia in the Ukraine war right now? As I said, if I were to put it against my framework of conflict settlement, the dilemma for Russia is how to move from an overt conflict to a conflict settlement, and not just a coerced peace, not just a victory on the battlefield, not just an imposed solution, but a reasonable and just settlement that takes the interest of all the parties involved, even if some of those parties might be represented by different governments in the not too distant future. But this is the great difficulty for Russia. It has fought a defensive war, a patient, defensive, slow war of attrition, but now it's facing a point where it can sense its opponents are reaching the point of exhaustion and potentially reaching a point of desperation. And it needs to make a decision as to how and what to do about advancing and engaging with its opponents. Should it occupy more of Ukraine than it ever planned to do? Should it engage with Europe, its opponent, so much over the last few years? Should it engage with the United States in a different way? And this decision is very much complicated by the state of the war and the belligerence of the other 4 parties involved. Now, there are, of course, many YouTube commentators and writers on the state of the military situation, and I'm not going to repeat all of their discussions, just to point out that, Ukraine is facing a military crisis in Pokrovsk and across the front in the Donbass. It's losing ground in other key parts of the front. It has a personnel crisis, it has a political crisis, it has an economic crisis, it has a social crisis, and it has a diplomatic crisis. And not least, it's running out of money to pay for its war. and running out of people to lend it money to pay for its war. So all of this military situation is having an impact on the peace and forcing all the different parties to perhaps recalibrate their objectives. But I'd really like to make 3 broad points about the situation for Russia as it moves right now from defensive war to a different kind of engagement with its opponents, and from overt conflict to conflict settlement. And those 3 points are really about the gains from military pressure, the inability of the United States to withdraw alone, and the complications of global permanent attrition war. First, let's talk about the gains from military pressure. Now, as I said, there are many military assessments of what's going on, including the most immediate crisis around Pokrovsk, and who knows what may happen between my recording, editing, and releasing this video. Collapse is always possible, but there are also strong forces against collapse. The advance has been slow so far. The likelihood is it's probably going to continue to be maybe a little bit faster, but still relatively slow. And it's not really in the interests of the United States, Britain, or Europe, let alone the Ukrainians, to see a rapid collapse of the Ukrainian military position, and therefore potentially all kinds of social order in Ukraine, given that it is a military government. And it's also potentially not in Russia's interest to collapse the house of cards in Ukraine right now. But Russia does need to force its opponents to make a new calculation over the gains and losses to be made from war versus peace. I expect the war to continue for most of 2026, unless there is, of course, some kind of sudden civil collapse in Ukraine. And there's reports just today about the level of anxiety in Bankova about political protests over energy shortfalls and problems with heating homes and supplying electricity to families in Ukraine this winter. So the pressure on the front in Ukrainian society is increasing, and I think critically for the diplomacy, this is aggravating the tensions, the gaps, the conflicts between the Axis powers, if I can call them that, Ukraine, EU, Britain, and the United States. The EU is itself splintering. Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary have talked about perhaps forming a kind of a peace party within the EU. There are tensions between the EU and Ukraine over the provision of funds, which can only at this point really be provided by basically stealing someone else's money, but also over the level of corruption in Ukraine and the approach of the Ukrainian government towards that corruption. That was the issue that there were so many protests about earlier this year, and a recent European Commission report has highlighted those tensions further in a less visible way, but certainly still happening. I think within the halls of the governments, within the cabinet rooms of the governments in Europe, there is increasing tension, argument between pro-US and pro-Europe elites within Europe, between pro-NATO and pro-European Union elites within Europe as well. Those conflicts will deepen as the dilemmas and the issues of Ukraine get worse in the absence of any credible solutions becomes more and more obvious. The second key point is about the failure of the US's exit strategy. Now, I have argued since February 2025 that the United States has been pursuing since Trump came to office, has been pursuing a unilateral war termination strategy in Ukraine. It's tried to get out of the war with as much loot as it can and with as little blame as it can. This strategy, the supposed Trump peace plan for Ukraine, has all fallen apart. And I think Russia has sort of put some hope in that strategy working. Why wouldn't they, I guess? If the United States were to pull out unilaterally from the war, if it were to stop arming, stop providing intelligence, stop providing funds, stop providing political cover, stop providing communications support for the Ukraine conflict, then it would really have a deep impact on the position for Ukraine, Europe and Britain. But this has really fallen apart. And I think the nature of this strategy is often obscured by a lot of the commentary on YouTube, in the geopolitical alternative mainstream media, if you like, often exacerbated by sort of American contempt for Europe, echoed in the US-affiliated podcaster community, but also evident in the US diplomatic strategy. J.D. Vance calling someone in Europe the enemy within, presumably. He was outing all the pro-American supporters within the European Union, but I don't think that was really what he meant. And until the bogus summit in Budapest, the Indian summer Budapest summit, Russia played along in the interest of the United States withdrawing unilaterally. But this has really fallen apart. Perhaps Russians were mesmerised or misled as much by MAGA and Trump as anyone, particularly in some of the commentariat and amongst the oligarchs. Let's think of people like Kirill Dmitriev, Alexander Dugin, even perhaps Glenn Deason got a little bit carried away with the seriousness of Donald Trump's diplomacy. This strategy of unilateral withdrawal did not fail because of neocons or because of continuity of agenda. It failed partly because of inertia of institutions, but it also failed because it was an incoherent, unexecutable strategy. The United States simply couldn't do it because it is too tangled up in the war in Ukraine. What would it mean in any case for the United States to get out of Ukraine, take out all the CIA bases, take out all the information operations, take out all the infiltration operations, take out, take its military bases out of Poland or Romania? Who knows? Who knows? Stop flying all those spy planes over the Black Sea. None of this was ever really clarified or ever really carefully thought through. And the fact is, the US is deeply entangled in Europe. It's not just a question of individual agendas or policy papers. There is an 80-year-old codependent relationship between the United States and Europe via NATO. Indeed, I argue that the United States has become dependent on Europe for its offense in the world. It's dependent upon Europe for many of its operations in Southwest Asia and North Africa, indeed. Europe gets really very little from the USA for real defence. It becomes rather a launching pad for American global strategy. Indeed, Europe is occupied territory and part of America's global military strategy. And neither Trump nor Biden nor Obama ever really seriously considered or entertained withdrawing to the sort of 1996 NATO boundaries as requested by Russia in its 2021 treaty proposal. So this whole strategy of playing along with Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the war was worth a try. It was perhaps only ever a 20% chance of success, particularly early in the term, but even early in the term, there were signs that Trump never really meant it. It was all more about political messaging. Biden's war, not my war. You know, I would never have started with me, and all that kind of nonsense. And for all the humiliating photo ops that Donald Trump imposed upon the Europeans. Think of that ridiculous White House photo. Think of the conversations where Mark Rutte called him daddy. For all of those humiliating photo ops, they are perhaps compensations for the US for its actual impotence, because in the end, Europe got what it wanted, didn't it? It kept Europe and Ukraine, and Britain kept the United States in the war. The third aspect is the problem of permanent attrition war, and this presents real problems for Russian strategy. Although it would be good if the United States was seriously dividing the labour or withdrawing from Europe, that simply doesn't deal with the reality of the global networked empire engaged in a permanent attrition war against its many opponents, the issue that I discussed in one of my earlier videos that Nell Bonilla has so expertly analysed. The USA pursues through NATO, and always has since 1949, a global war of permanent attrition. And in this sense, the war in Ukraine is actually a pivotal anchor of American global strategy. And this is the real struggle over a ceasefire or frozen conflict, because in America's permanent attrition war, ceasefire and frozen conflicts are just other names for deceptions about continuing the war. This is the problem Russia is confronting. It cannot accept the continuation of the global permanent attrition war. That's the real issue in play in the debate about a ceasefire or frozen conflict in Ukraine. But how do you get a grip on a global networked empire pursuing a global attrition war against you? That is the question. How do you deal with the American Leviathan? I say go for the jewel in the crown of the American Raj, just as the British Empire was irrecoverably weakened by the loss of India in 1947 and the other South Asian states of the British Empire. So the American Raj will be irrecoverably weakened if Russia, China can split Europe from the USA, if it can take Europe out of participation in the USA's permanent total war. If that happens, then the empire will implode. So I argue the only antidote to permanent attrition war is to do a Kissinger for Putin to go to Brussels and to make peace with Europe, to engineer an American-European split. Unlike the USA, I think that Russia has the capacity to do this, the diplomatic capacity, the strategic thinking capacity, the economic interests in Europe, but will it be able to do so given some of the root causes of the problem? That is an open question, and it is not entirely in Russia's control. So let me step through my three-step process to look at how then Russia could arguably move from war to peace by making peace with Europe in the war in Ukraine. Step one, as you might recall, was to respond to the root causes of the conflict, not just address them or to identify them, but actually respond to them. And in looking at the root causes of the conflict, for clarity's sake, I use the four-fold framework of motives, fundamental root causes of war, identified in Richard Overy's book Why War: Power, Belief, Interests and Security, as a way of economically simply sort of boiling down the root causes of the conflict. So in Russia's case, all four of these factors are in play. In terms of power, there is an issue about the multipolarity, balance of power across the world that reflects the growing prosperity, the growing role of many nations other than the West. There is a question about asserting Russian sovereignty in its domain and pushing back against that slow motion invasion, that slow motion infiltration of Russian society by American influence since the late 1980s. And there is also a question of power around the mismanaged separation of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the mismanaged separation of Ukraine and Russia that was referred to by the British ambassador to Moscow in the 1990s, Roderick Braithwaite, and Vladimir Putin's mentor, Anatoly Sobchak, explicitly referred to as a question like the way in which Chamberlain and others mismanaged relations with Stalin and Hitler in the 1930s. There's also a question about belief. There's resistance to the neo-imperialism, if you like, the Western civilizational rhetoric, the liberal rules-based order that comes from the West. There is also resistance to, and one of the root causes of the conflict has been the growth of the sort of anti-Russia extreme nationalism element within Ukraine over the last 30 years, something that was identified back in 1991, I might add, including by some of the people in the United States of America, but that belief has grown like a cancer in Ukraine, and that is one of the causes of the war. The whole idea of, is Ukraine a fraternal nation of Russia, or is it the suppressed nation resisting Russian colonialism in a war of independence to re-establish the gates of Europe between the Mongol horde and the European civilized garden, as authors like Sergei Plokhy will put it, and Timothy Snyder. And you can also see this question of belief coming through in the discussions of Alexei Arestovich, who increasingly says, well, there is a kind of Russian world, a Ruski mir, a civilizational zone, which Ukraine should choose to be part of that rather than to be part of the West, and that the anti-Russia project is one of the fundamental causes of the war, and hence one of the ways in which, by supporting those within Ukraine who are less adamantly opposed to Russia, then you can actually start to respond to those root causes. There are also questions of interest, aren't there? There's the USA and EU competition over access to the Ukrainian resources, but also to the Russian resources. There's the whole talk about breaking up Russia, just as they broke up the Soviet Union, and thereby weakening the sovereign control that the largest country by territory in the world of its sovereign resources. And of course, there are major security issues. The eastward expansion of NATO, if you like, NATO's 30-year slow-motion invasion of Russia and its persistent interference in Russian affairs since 1991 present major security issues. They are the root causes of the conflict. And unlike the other states, at least in my assessment, unlike the other states in this conflict, Russia has credible responses to each of these issues. It has a credible proposal on rebalancing power in the multipolar world. It has a credible proposal for establishing constitutional rights for Russians and things like that within Russia that deal with the mismanaged dissolution of Russia in Ukraine. It has a clear agenda about respecting Russian human rights, to let go of the neo-imperialism and the gates of Europe kind of rhetoric. It is a little less clear, but has always kept the door open for economic cooperation with Europe. It's tried to open the door to economic cooperation with the United States, but Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1, after all, were fundamental elements of shared interests between Russia and Europe. And of course, in terms of security, it has made proposals persistently for decades around collective security agreements in Europe that have been persistently ignored. Now, I would argue that many of the proposals that it has put have been too focused on responding to the root causes, getting the United States on side in responding to the root causes of the conflict, and perhaps it's time now for Russia to put more effort into getting Europe on side for responding to the root causes of the conflict. After all, I think on all of those issues there are more things in common between Europe and Russia to solve each of those problems then there is motivation, I guess, for the United States to really solve those problems. Europe, too, has an interest in rebalancing power more equally around the world, not being so servile to the United States. Europe has a long-standing tradition of embracing Russia as part of a greater European culture. Europe has enormous economic interests in Russia and Russian resources, Russian energy, which it has compromised as part of this war. And Europe, after all, has a lot more interest in the security of Europe than does the United States. Why are the American soldiers still there, occupying European cities, occupying bases in America, compromising the security of Europe every day, 80 years after World War II? So I argue the best long-term partner for Russia in responding to the root causes of the conflict is Europe. Europe needs to be not denazified, but denatoized. So step 2 in my framework is about making sure the peace party prevails. Now, this is an issue in Russia too. Russia too has peace parties and war factions, or if you like, there are the people supporting Alexander I in the defensive strategy for Borodino, and the others who say, well, we should attack more aggressively against our invaders. In 1812, there was much criticism of the defensive war strategy pursued by Alexander and Kutuzov and others. And you can see new variations of that kind of criticism today in some of what I call the triumph of the will criticisms launched by people like Gilbert Doctorow and others who believe that, Russia needs to get tough with Europe or the United States. And here I think it is worth noting that the Vladimir Putin's speech at Valdai in October 2025 very much affirmed the fact that the peace party is prevailing in Russia, and that is good news for peace in Ukraine. He commented, and let me quote here from the speech, that linear unilateral solutions are impossible. Unilateral solutions like those proposed all the time by the United States, while non-linear and multilateral solutions require very serious, professional, impartial, creative, and at times unconventional diplomacy. I really do feel that the Valdai speech was in part a justification to the Russian public for saying we need to keep pursuing the path of diplomacy with the United States, and perhaps we should also open a bigger door to diplomacy with Europe. Again, he noted that I am convinced that we will witness a kind of renaissance, a revival of high diplomatic art. Its essence lies in the ability to engage in dialogue and reach agreements, not something the United States is well known for, both with neighbours and like-minded partners. Who are the neighbours he's talking about? He's talking about, well, China and, Central Asia, all that sort of stuff, the Caucasus, but also, of course, Europe. And no less, but more important, more challenging with opponents. He's not closing the door to diplomacy, even with the most adamantly opposed people in Europe, United States, or indeed Ukraine. He says, let me repeat once again, conflicts and collisions of interest have been and of course will remain forever. The question is how to resolve them, how to move from conflict to conflict settlement. A polycentric world, as I have already said today, is a return to the classical diplomacy where settlement needs attention, mutual respect, but not coercion. It cannot win on the battlefield. It cannot coerce a peace in the way that Donald Trump coerces peace. It cannot win on the battlefield. It needs classical diplomacy to win the peace. Again, he says, classical diplomacy was capable of taking into account the positions of different international actors, the complexity of the concert of Europe, made up of the voices of different powers. The one Alexander I established at the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815. Still, at a certain stage, it was replaced by the Western kind of diplomacy of monologues, endless preaching and orders. Ultimatums from Donald Trump, demonstrations of virtue. Instead of resolving conflicts, certain parties began to push through their own selfish interests, considering the interests of everyone else unworthy of attention. No wonder that instead of settlement, conflicts were only further exacerbated up to the point of their transition to a bloody armed phase, leading to a humanitarian disaster. Acting like this means a failure to resolve any conflict. Examples over the past 30 years are countless. This is almost a manifesto of saying Russia wants to pursue serious diplomacy, wants to pursue the path of peace, to move from overt conflict to conflict settlement and have an enduring just settlement that deals with the interests of all parties. Would you like to join us, Europe, USA, Britain and Ukraine? The third step in my process is for the sovereign authority to act. Now, as I discussed in my USA video, this is a real problem in the United States. The state, the government in the United States is so fragmented, so overextended, so over distributed around the world and across different interests, public and private, that it is very hard for any serious intention to be conceived, agreed, executed, and thoroughly implemented through to a conclusion that lasts for more than 24 hours, that lasts for 5 to 10 years. But this is less of a problem in Russia. There is no doubt that Russia has this capacity for sovereign action, unlike, I would say, USA, Ukraine, and the EU. Russia does not suffer Europe's deeply divided sovereignty. I think all states have some interdependence in their sovereignty today, but Russia does not suffer Europe's deeply divided sovereignty. It does not have its defence policy determined by a power like the United States. But Russia's greatest problem, I think, will be to help its neighbour Europe to match Russia's executive coherence. It can come to the diplomatic party, but it needs to find a mutually understanding, mutually capable and competent partner to form a genuine agreement. And this is, I think, perhaps Russia's greatest challenge right now. But there are potential pathways out of this dilemma. I doubt it will be resolved with Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen in charge of the EU, but no politician's career lasts forever. Russia might want to explore finding grounds for cooperation with its neighbours that limit or even exclude the interference of the USA and Britain in the extreme nationalist factions within the Ukraine in dealing with the problem. And I think there is a looming social crisis in Ukraine that will demand practical, pragmatic, intelligent, humane and compassionate government action to deal with arguably millions of people who will go through a social order crisis, a public disorder crisis, breakdown of authority, a breakdown of the economy, a breakdown of social rules, deep post-conflict settlement resolution problems as well, not to mention a potential refugee crisis in Europe. Europe and Russia have a deep shared interest in a better governance of this social crisis that is coming in Ukraine at some point in the next 48 months. It could even be sooner. It could be by the springtime. Even some British papers are speculating on that as well. But this, I think, is potentially the pathway for Europe and Russia to find ways again together to cooperate as genuine sovereign actors together in their shared interest. So what does this mean in terms of practical proposals then to advance the peace process, to move from war to peace in Ukraine? I think Russia should abandon its indulgence of the USA's unilateralism and its indulgence of Trump's grandiose vision of, making the empire great again, and abandon its strategy of seeking the US to withdraw unilaterally. I think Russia should pursue a peace process in which Europe, under perhaps different leadership, or at least with chastened leadership, is the principal party of the negotiations, of the principal counterpart in the negotiations, and newly constituted Ukraine of some kind is the secondary party. The USA and Britain should move to the background of the negotiations more as coordination partners. They, after all, do not live in the neighbourhood. They shouldn't be locked out of the settlement, but they, especially given their global significance. But I think Britain, as I might discuss, as I will discuss in my video on Britain, has generally not played a constructive role at all in the war or the peace negotiations. And I think the USA is demonstrated it is not capable of leading a genuine multilateral peace negotiation, peace initiative anywhere. I think Russia should offer the USA a dignified withdrawal from Europe. It should pursue reduced American and encourage Europe to demand reduced American authority and command within NATO, perhaps as a preparatory phase to the winding down or reconfiguration of NATO, to reorient it to genuine, limited defensive security in Europe, not the global projection of American power that NATO has been since 1949. There are some ways I would suggest this could happen. For example, Europe could demand that NATO forces in Europe be commanded by a European officer, a European general. No longer American generals in charge of European troops and whinging about the way that they don't pay enough to America for all those great American weapons. Put Europeans in charge of the European defence of Europe and ask the Americans to get out. I would also propose that even if NATO doesn't withdraw to its 1996 boundaries, one interesting midway step might be that all US troops, all US forces, all US-run facilities and all US missiles, etc., that are stationed in Eastern Europe, east of the 1996 NATO boundaries, should be withdrawn, perhaps over a schedule over a number of years from that area. If you like, de-NATOise, take the American side out of that conflict. Now, of course, some of those states, Poland, etc., have a deep interest and a deep engagement with the United States in their security, of course, understandably, and they can continue to defend them. But wouldn't it significantly improve the collective security? Wouldn't it significantly reduce tension if all those American troops east of Berlin that have marched, that have slowly invaded Russia since 1991, if they were all withdrawn? That would be a serious move towards peace. And related to that, and an issue I might get to more in my next video on Britain, I would propose that Russia and Europe together, perhaps with the United States, having a few stern words to King Charles, demand the removal of all British bases and territories in Europe. No more British Gibraltar, no more British Cyprus, no more British intelligence bases and operations in, I think there's 11 military 11 British military bases in Eastern Europe today. Who said the British Empire was over? I'd say let's get that out as well. We all know Britain has been one of the most belligerent parties in this war, one of the most aggressive prosecutors on the ideological and intelligence and military fronts in this war. It left the European Union of its own volition some time ago. I think it's really time for all the military presence of Britain to get the hell out of Europe. So there's 3 specific proposals I think that could actually advance the discussion. Less USA in Europe, more Europe in Europe, less American involvement in NATO command and its withdrawal from Eastern Europe. And this may form a good starting point towards a broader discussion about Eurasian security without external partners. That discussion is advancing. On the east side of Eurasia, it's time to advance it on the western peninsula of Eurasia as well. Finally, whatever peace settlement that does progress is going to have to deal with the political solution in Ukraine, whether that is some kind of partition, whether that's some kind of reconfiguration. But I think the time is not ready yet for that discussion. I will return to that in my video on Ukraine, but that should certainly be a key part of it. I think there's a lot for the United States to gain from this and a lot for Russia to gain from this. Russia could show and help its strategic partner China with this problem. It could show the US a peaceful way for it to withdraw with dignity, without humiliation, without harm to its economic interests, in fact, probably with benefit to its domestic political interests. It can withdraw from its global planetary occupation. First in Europe, first in Ukraine, first in Eastern Europe, then perhaps from all of Europe, and then perhaps let's do it in the West Pacific and East Asia. I'm not saying that the USA is up for that challenge yet. I suspect that it and its more belligerent allies, some of the leadership in the EU and of course Britain, may need to suffer some setbacks, some defeats on the battlefield before that happens. But defeat happens on the battlefield. Peace is won at the diplomatic table. Let the defeat on the battlefield be an invitation to win a peace at the diplomatic table. There's a lot for Europe to gain. There is a lot for Russia to gain. If they can follow the example of Alexander I and Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna and find a way for Russia to make peace with Europe, in Ukraine, in Europe, in the world. Thanks for watching, and do make sure to subscribe to my Substack at jeffrich.substack to get all my analysis. I'm just about to begin my world history tour of Russia. It is a must read if you're interested in these sort of issues, and I'll be back with you for my next video on Britain's role in the Ukraine war very soon. Thanks for watching.